All right. Thanks everyone for coming to the FOSS seminar, Population Health Seminar this semester. It's my great pleasure to have Professor Lei Jin from CUHK. Professor Lei Jin received master's degree in statistics and a PhD in sociology from University of Chicago. Before joining CUHK, she was a postdoc fellow at Robert Johnson Foundation Scholars in Health Policy at Harvard University. Professor Lei Jin's work focuses on the interplay of health, medicine, and social systems. And her work falls into two areas. One is about social determinants of health, and the other one is about social organization of healthcare. So in the first area, she has studied how people's social relationships are linked to their health-related outcomes. She has published papers assessing how marital status affects their utilization of healthcare, and how the local and the translocal social ties influence rural to urban migrants' mental health by shaping their social comparisons. She's also very interested in studying how structural inequality affects individual health through research psychosocial pathways. In her current project, she's investigating how relative social status and the status inconsistency and the social mobility influence health. And today her talk is also about this topic. And she also has studied the consequence of migration for psychological well-being and the health impacts of contextual social inequality in China. In the second area about social organization of healthcare, she has studied this patient-doctor interaction in the US and the changing patterns in the use of Chinese medicine in China. Her ongoing project in this area focuses on professional autonomy among physicians in China's public hospital reforms. Professor Jin is very productive, and she has published papers in demography, social science medicine, social science research, and health affairs, and so on. And she's also very successful in landing the grant proposals from funding agencies, including including 5 GIF. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to have Professor Lei Jin here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Zheng, for your kind introduction. So I am very happy to have this opportunity here to, can you hear me? Okay, to talk about my work. So this is the first time I'm presenting these results. I'm really very much looking forward to your comments. Okay, so the title of my talk is Status Inconsistency, Institutional Context, and Psychological Well-being Across National Analysis. So let me first talk about the motivation for the study. Okay, so this study was motivated by an earlier paper that focused on China. As a lot of you know, in China, decades of robust economic growth has lifted the living standards of the whole society and also enriched a substantial segment of the population, but access to political power has been limited. So it's been long suspected and speculated that the incongruence between growing economic status or resources and the lack of political power may spawn dissatisfaction, frustration, and anxiety. So in that paper, we empirically examined this hypothesis. We tapped into a long line of sociological research on status inconsistency, which said that status inconsistency, which means that if you occupy incongruent positions in different hierarchies, then there would be consequences for people's psychology, for their attitudes, for their behavior. So we tapped into this literature and we used survey data to assess the hypothesis, and we actually found nothing. There was the result that we found no results that although there was significant differences between people's perceived positions in the power and wealth hierarchies, it doesn't matter for their psychological well-being. Okay, so that's what we found. And then we went on to wonder whether this null finding is specific to China or whether it can be generalized to other places, right? And we were also intrigued by some discussions in the status inconsistency literature, which says that status inconsistency has to be sort of turned on or activated so as to produce consequences, right? So here I have a quote from a review paper a long time ago. It says status inconsistency is like a switch, dead or alive, depending on whether or not there is something behind it to give it a role to play. Okay. So this means that whether status inconsistency would be consequential depends on the social context in which it occurs. And also the sort of imbalance between power and wealth is also not unique to China, right? It's observed across the globe in studies of developing societies. There has been a recurring theme that the new middle class was often seen as striving for political power that would be commensurate with their growing economic status, which implies that there is a mismatch, there is an imbalance or incongruence between people's power status and wealth status. And also in developed societies, it has been argued, especially during recent 1 or 2 decades, that the political space of the middle class was squeezed by the super rich, again implying that there is an imbalance between people's power status and wealth status. So this imbalance is not unique, right? And so we were then wonder whether the switch of status inconsistency would be turned on in some social context, so to speak. So our general research question would be, does the link between the power wealth incongruence and psychological well-being differ by institutional context? Okay, so I'm gonna talk about why status inconsistency would have psychological impact and what kind of institutional context would condition that kind of link. Okay, first, a status inconsistency refers to the extent of incongruence in individuals' positions in different hierarchies. And the conventional theory of status inconsistency says that it may produce unfavorable psychological, psychosocial consequences. So it would generate because people occupy different positions simultaneously on different hierarchies, right? So this would generate conflicting expectations by the self, right? So we would see ourselves. There would be conflicting when we evaluate our positions. There would be conflicts from conflicting expectations generated from different hierarchies, right? And also there would be conflicting expectations from others, right? It could be that I myself would evaluate my status based on my position in one hierarchy, but people around me evaluates my status based on another hierarchy, right? So there would be conflicting expectations. There would also be conflicting expectations in terms of my evaluation of other people's view of myself, right? So it's the sort of idea of the looking glass self, which may lead to problems in self-image, which in turn result in heightened stress and reduced well-being. So that was one part of the conventional hypothesis. And also individuals may feel the need to bring their relatively low positions to similar levels to similar levels of their relatively high positions, and the inability to do so may generate relative deprivation, which may lead to psychological and somatic consequences. So that's the hypothesis that status inconsistency can have detrimental psychosocial consequences. On the other hand, there has also been hypotheses about the alternative psychological mechanisms that people may employ to deal with inconsistent positions, which is that individuals may focus on the status dimensions in which they enjoy higher positions, whereas at the same time discount the dimensions in which they suffer disadvantages. This is actually what we found in our previous study in China, which showed that people who are high on their wealth hierarchy but low in the power hierarchy would so these people would emphasize their position in the wealth hierarchy. Their higher position in the wealth hierarchy has more impact on their psychological well-being than their lower position in the power hierarchy. So that's sort of the alternative psychological mechanism that people can take, right, when they face the situation of inconsistent positions in different hierarchies. At the same time, it has also been argued that status inconsistency has to be made irrelevant and problematic before it may generate unfavorable psychosocial consequences. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that the switch of status inconsistency has to be turned on. And there are, the sort of the past literature offered several of these circumstances that are crucial to how status inconsistency would be interpreted. So the first has to do with social comparison, which and the argument is that an actor whose ranks are unbalanced is unlikely to find it disturbing if the comparison is made to others who are similarly unbalanced, right? So the idea is that we wouldn't know that we're unbalanced, or the unbalance is taken as a common situation if everybody else around me faces the same imbalance, right? So if everyone around me has little access to institutionalized channels of, for example, political participation, then maybe I would take this as given, right? Take this for granted. And the second circumstances has to do with independence of status hierarchies. That is, the hierarchies on which incongruence occurs have to be related for the incongruence to be meaningful. So a common example that was given was that if a professor goes fishing with a graduate student, and the graduate student turns out to be a much better fisherman than the professor, right? So then the professor would be higher in terms of academic status, right, but lower in terms of the fisherman status. But this wouldn't be conflicting or disturbing to the professor because these two dimensions are separate, right? They're in different domains. We wouldn't imagine that the quality that contribute to one status in one hierarchy would be meaningful for their success in the second hierarchy, right? So, so the two hierarchies have to be considered to be somewhat related and interchangeable, right? So in coming back to our topic here, that is, we would have to think that the higher position in the wealth hierarchy would be meaningful for higher position in the power hierarchy and vice versa, right? So that's the second sort of condition or circumstances. The third is what's called expectation incongruence. That is, beliefs in the legitimacy of the distribution of resources and rewards may result in expectations of incongruent status. So if people believe that the distribution of political power and economic resources are legitimate, right? So even if there are discrepancies or inconsistencies, these inconsistencies would be expected. So if our experiences matched expectation, that's fine for us, right? It's because the differences or the inconsistencies are expected. Okay, so so these circumstances are then then it's right. So these arguments tell us that the relevance and interpretation of status inconsistency then depends on the social context in which it occurs, right? So we build on these arguments, in this project, in this paper, we look at the political institutions, and how political institutions would condition the effects of status inconsistency, because political institutions constitute fundamental principles of organizing power in a society, and specific configurations of political institutions may condition or shape how the power-wealth incongruence is interpreted and what the effects of the incongruence is, right? Then the specific configurations of political institution may condition citizens' access to political power, and thereby influence social comparison. They may also shape people's idea about the interdependence of power and wealth statuses. And they may also influence citizens' beliefs in the legitimacy of the distribution of economic resources and political power. So then we just make our research question more specific. That is, how does the link between the power-wealth incongruence differ in societies with different configurations of power, political institutions, right? So we think that the different configurations of political institutions may influences the circumstances that would influence how people interpret interpret inconsistencies in their power and wealth statuses, right? Which may then influence their psychological well-being. Okay, so we use a specific measurement called the democracy index, which is a multidimensional measure of a society's political institutions to indicate to measure the specific configurations of political institutions. Okay, and I'm going to make some very tentative hypotheses about, in what kind of political institutions would be more conducive to the effects of status inconsistency. So in terms of social comparison, in sort of non-democratic societies, which would be measured with low democracy index, then people's access to institutionalized channels of political power or political participation would be low, right? So then this would lead to sort of the condition of insulation, and then the risk of social comparison would be, that would activate status inconsistency would be also low. But in societies that would be generally committed to a democratic electoral process and political participation, then there may be more social comparison in terms of the access to political power. Okay, so here I indicate that in low democracy context, the social comparison would be low, right? In the other context, there are possibilities of social comparison. Now, in terms of status interdependence, so this has to do with whether the two hierarchies are related or to some extent interchangeable. Now, whether we think wealth begets power or power begets wealth also depends on the political configuration, right, in the societies with functioning democratic institutions and also with less corruption, right, when the government is more functional, then we would, the status in interdependence would be also lower, right? So that's why the arrow is going down in high democracy context, where they're going up in the low or middle democracy context. So in terms of the last condition, the expectation incongruence, that is whether there are sort of trust or beliefs in the legitimacy of the system. In past literature, there is generally there are more sort of empirical literature shows that there is more trust in the political system in societies with more functioning democratic institutions, generally reflecting the sort of the quality of the institutions. So here we would put expectation incongruence to be congruence to be high, which is less likely to activate social status inconsistency. Whereas it would be lower in sort of the hybrid regimes. In the situation of low democracy context or societies with more less functioning democratic institutions, there has been a literature on what's called system justification theory, which shows that, in fact, support for the status quo tends to be high in more authoritarian regimes. So taking these all together, we have this very tentative expectation that the link between power, wealth, incongruence, and well-being may be the strongest in hybrid form of political institutions, that is in this middle area. Okay, so that's sort of the expectation we have. So because this is a population health seminar, so I want to talk about the significance of this study in terms of, especially situated in the research on population health. So a large amount of research has examined how social inequalities influence health and well-being through both material and psychosocial pathways. Now, most research focused on what's called the vertical aspect of social stratification, that is the health consequences of people's location in distinct hierarchies. But there's also what's called the horizontal aspect, that is people may occupy positions in different hierarchies. And what are the relations among these different hierarchies, right? So this project, or this study specifically want to address this horizontal aspect. And as I mentioned, there has been a long tradition of studying status inconsistency in sociology, which was really flourishing in the 60s and 70s. But because of methodological difficulties and some other issues, the research hasn't been very active in terms of in studying social status inconsistency. But this topic has started to receive more attention in the research on health inequalities recently, and many more studies had appeared. And this study tried to contribute to this area of research. Okay, now let me introduce the data we use for this study. So we use data from the 2019 Gallup Ward Poll. Now, Gallup Ward Poll is a yearly survey that has very wide coverage around 150 countries. So we work with them, and we picked 29 countries and regions with diverse, with very diverse political institutions. So in each country, the Gallup Ward Poll collected probabilistic and representative samples of population over the age of 15. So the analytical sample includes more than 33,000 respondents. Okay, so here is some characteristics of the sample. Okay, so in terms of the dependent variable, we use two sets of variables to measure psychological well-being. The first dependent variable is life satisfaction. So people were asked, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 to 10. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. So which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? So it's a actually 11 level measurement of life satisfaction. And here I showed the distribution of life satisfaction for the 29 countries in the sample. So the blue represents the lowest level, right? And the red is the middle level, and green is the top levels. So first, we can see that we have a diverse set of countries here, right? We also have 3 Chinese societies, China here. We also have Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Okay, so 3 Chinese societies here. And we can also see that there is a lot of variation in people's life satisfaction, right? So I sorted the countries in terms of the percentage of people with the lowest levels of life satisfaction, and we can see that Zimbabwe had the lowest, right? Okay, so that's the first dependent variable we have, and the second set of dependent variables measures what I call people's negative and positive affects. So these, in the survey, people were asked about their feelings and emotions. Okay, whether they feel well rested, treated with respect, smile or laughed a lot, whether they felt enjoyment, worry, pain, sadness, stress, or anger. Right. So, so these were questions having more to do with people's feelings and emotions. So I used factor analysis to extract 2 factors, one related to negative affect, the other related to positive affect. And okay, so here are the distribution of the mean of negative affect, the mean of positive affect in the countries in our sample. So for the negative affect, lower the better, right? Positive affect, the higher the better. Okay, so we can also see that the negative affect and positive affect are somewhat different from life satisfactions, right? So for example, we saw that China were actually pretty, China and Taiwan are pretty good in terms of having low negative affect and high positive affect, right? But also the positive, negative affect and positive affect are not perfectly correlated. It's not true that if you're low on positive affect, then you're high on negative affect, right? So I saw a country that was pretty high on both scales, but I don't remember which one. I think it's Chile, right? So Chile is high on negative affect. It's also high on positive affect. Okay, so these are the dependent variables. Now, in terms of independent variables measuring people's power status, we ask this question. Again, imagine a ladder from 0 to 10. Suppose we say that at the top of the ladder represents people in this country who have the most influence over their local government, and the bottom of the ladder represents people in this country who have the least influence. By influence over local government, I mean influence over the officials and behavior of the city, county government. On which step of the ladder do you think you would personally stand, right? So that's the, this probably would be a question that's hard to answer. But we did get answers from our respondents. Okay, and you can see that people tend to rate their standings in this hierarchy to be quite low, right? And Hong Kong is actually quite low. Now the data was collected in 2019, and it's quite understandable that people's rating would be quite low here. Okay, so in terms of wealth hierarchy, we ask the same question, except that we substitute, influence with wealth. Okay, there is more variation here, and although a lot of people would still put them at the lower end of the hierarchy, they tend to rate themselves higher on the wealth hierarchy than the power hierarchy. We compare the 2 distributions. Okay. So now, if we look at status incongruence, then we see that the biggest group is people who rate their power status to be lower than their wealth status, close to 50%. 30% of people rated their positions on the two hierarchies to be the same, and 24% would rate their wealth status to be higher than their power status. Okay, so that's the sort of simple measurement of status incongruence. Okay. And then in terms of democracy index, so this is an index compiled by the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is a subunit of the Economist magazine, and it combines information on I think 5 or 6 dimensions in terms of democratic political institutions. So it combines information on the extent to which citizens can choose their political leaders in free and fair elections, enjoy civil liberties, including freedoms of speech and free media, prefer democracy over other political systems, can and do participate in politics, and have a functioning government that acts on their behalf. Okay, so here is the values of the democracy index for the 29 societies we include in our sample, and we divide them into 3 groups. Okay, so anything below 4 was the sort of low democracy context, and the economist intelligence unit would call it the authoritarian regimes, and from 4 to 7 is the hybrid regime, and anything greater than 7 would be the democracies. So we divided the societies into these 3 types, and we would see what the relationship between status inconsistency and people's psychological well-being is. Okay. Okay. First, I want to show you sort of perceived power status by regime types. Okay. So we can see that when we go from authoritarian to democracy, more people would rate themselves in the middle, although still most people would still rate them in the bottom tiers, right, of the hierarchy, even in sort of what's considered democratic societies. But actually, in both in authoritarian and hybrid regimes, there would be more percentage-wise, more people consider themselves to be at the top than those in the democratic societies. Right. So in terms of wealth status, the same situation, but it's particularly prominent that in democratic societies, more people would see themselves as in the middle of the wealth distribution than in other regimes. Okay, now because more people would see themselves as in the middle in the democratic regimes, this leads to the situation that actually in democratic societies, more people would be status inconsistent. That is, their wealth, their perceived rank in the wealth hierarchy would be greater than their perceived rank in the power hierarchy, right? Okay. So we actually see more status inconsistent, proportionally status more consistent individuals in democratic societies in this category. Okay, okay. So that's the distribution of both in terms of the rankings and in terms of incongruence by regime types. Okay. So here, so we also have a number of control variables. I would particularly want to mention that we control for country dummies. So that is, we have the country level fixed effect to control for country level idiosyncrasies. Okay, so the method we use is what's called diagonal mobility model. Specifically use this model because in the study of status inconsistency, there has long been the difficulty that methodological difficulty that status inconsistency is collinear with the 2 constituent statuses, right? So if you know the 2 statuses, then you know what the status inconsistency conditions are, right? there had been different models that had been proposed to tackle this kind of problem. So here I used what's called a diagonal mobility model, which was developed to study actually social mobility. But social mobility is also similar situation with status inconsistency. So social mobility looks at differences in people's status over time, whereas status inconsistency looks at the differences in the two status simultaneously occupied by the same individual, right? Okay, so this model was developed to simultaneously assess the relative importance of two variables with identical categories and variables indicating the differences between the two variables. Okay, okay. So the particular problem of examining status inconsistency can be shown with this this table, right? So say if we have wealth status on 5 categories and power status also in 5 categories, we can have a 5 by 5 table, and the people who are in the cells who are off diagonal are people who are status inconsistent. People who are on the diagonal are status consistent, right? So the sort of simple or naive approach of assessing status inconsistency is to compare people who are in the off diagonal cells to people who are in the diagonal cells, right? But people who are in the off diagonal cells are also people who are in the off diagonal cells differ from people in the diagonal cells, not only in terms of status or not in terms of status inconsistency, but also in terms of their power and wealth status, right? So the extent that you see that people on the off diagonal are different from people who are on the diagonal, you wouldn't know whether this is because one group is status consistent, the other group is not status consistent, or because people occupy different positions on the wealth status. So the way diagonal mobility model deal with this problem is that the average levels of the dependent variables, say we're looking at life satisfaction of a status inconsistent person, for example, a person who occupies 2 on the wealth hierarchy and 4 in the power hierarchy, their mean level of the dependent variable, say life satisfaction, would be a weighted sum of the mean level of the dependent variable of people who are status consistent in the respective hierarchies, right? So this is a little bit, this is a mouthful, but basically, so the mean level of life satisfaction for people in this category would be calculated like, would be modeled like this. Okay, so it would be, P would be the weight of power status for life satisfaction, and Q would be the weight of wealth status for life satisfaction, and this sum would be estimated as the mean level of life satisfaction for people who are in the off-diagonal cell who are status inconsistent. So this is sort of a more parsimonious way to estimate, to control for the power and wealth status, and simultaneously estimating the effect of status inconsistency. Okay, so this is what the model would look like, right? So this is dependent variable is the value of the dependent variable in cell ij of the cross table of power and wealth status that has k observations. Okay, so and P would be the weight of the one dimension on the dependent variable, and Q would be the weight of another dimension on the dependent variable. Okay, so here we can also include a number of, so here are the we can include variables indicating status inconsistency. For example, the dummy variables indicating whether a person's wealth hierarchy is lower than power hierarchy or vice versa. Okay, and then there can be a number of control variables. Okay, now in this model we can also allow the weight for the power status or the wealth status to vary across to vary for different group. And in this in our particular model, we allow the weight for the power and wealth status to vary for different statuses of different conditions of status inconsistency. So this would allow us to model the situation that people who have lower wealth status than power status to give more weight to their power status, right? So to model this kind of status substitution situations. Okay, so this is the diagonal mobility model. Okay, okay. So here, let me show you the results. Okay, so here this is results from the whole sample. Okay, so what we show here is, so this is the weight for power and wealth status. So basically they show how important these two hierarchies are for people's life satisfaction, negative affect and positive affect. So we can see that wealth are more important than power, which would be expected, right? So especially for negative affect, the power status, their weight is quite low. Okay. Okay, so this part of the model shows us basically the mean levels of the dependent variable for status congruent individuals. So people who are on the diagonal, right? When control variables are 0. So this just shows you that when you go up the status, life satisfaction goes up, right? Negative affect goes down and positive affect goes up, right? So this is also expected. Okay, then we go on to look at status incongruence and psychological well-being in democratic societies with democratic institutions. So we basically saw nothing. So status incongruence doesn't matter for any of our dependent variables, right? Whether people perceive wealth greater than power or power greater than wealth, there's no association whatsoever. And what we saw here is that people, there's clear evidence that there is this situation that so here for people who have higher wealth, lower power, they give more weight. They give more weight to their wealth status. Wealth status. For people who think that their power is greater than their wealth, they give more weight to their power statuses. Okay. Okay, so there is so this is the findings from democracies. Okay, so if we're looking at hybrid regimes, things are a little bit different. Still, if wealth is greater than power, right? So thinking about your middle class with little access to political power, it doesn't matter. Okay, but if power is greater than wealth, we do see sort of negative sort of negative association with life satisfaction, right? So these people have lower life satisfaction. They have more negative affect, and they have less positive affects. So generally, people who perceive their power to be greater than their wealth are not doing so well psychologically compared with those people who are status consistent. Okay. I'll move faster. Okay, so if we're looking at status incongruence and psychological well-being in sort of low democracy situation, authoritarian regimes, so the condition of wealth greater than power, still it's statistically insignificant, right? So no effect whatsoever. But in terms of if power is greater than wealth, then these people again experience more negative effect, right? Everything else being equal. Okay. So right. So that these are the findings for these three types of societies. These societies with three types of political institutions. Okay, we also did some sensitivity analysis. So we look at different specifications of the status variable. For example, we would group the status variable into 5 categories, also different indicators of status incongruence. So maybe so here we're defining status incongruence as if your power status and wealth status are different from by one level, you would be considered to be status incongruent, right? So we then also change the indicator of status incongruence to indicating difference by at least 2 levels. Okay, and we got very similar results, right? Okay, so that's the sort of the sensitivity analysis we've done so far. Okay, so in terms of just to summarize, we did find sort of incongruence between power and wealth status in different societies with different configurations of political institutions. So even in what's considered sort of the societies with more democratic institutions, we saw the difference in power and wealth status. But the biggest finding of this study is perhaps that there's no effect, right, of the high wealth, low power individual did not report detriments in psychological well-being in any institutional context, right? So going back to the question that motivated the study, so whether, if you imagine the situation in which the rising middle class not happy with not having enough political power, we did not find any evidence for the that this kind of situation would bring any psychological detriments. Okay, so that's the null finding. I think it's also quite interesting, even though it's a null finding. So this goes against a lot of the speculation that we saw that as societies are transforming quickly in developing societies, the rising middle class would be unhappy, right, with at least we didn't see the unhappy part. There could be other kinds of consequences for people's attitudes or for their behavior. But in terms of psychological well-being, there was very little evidence for the effect of the incongruence. But we did observe that the people who think that they had more power than wealth, they did report sort of detriments in psychological well-being, particularly in hybrid regimes and to a lesser extent in authoritarian regimes. But not in democratic social contexts. So this could be, right, so this is speculation that in these kinds of social contexts, there is more of an expectation of the interdependence between the two statuses. If I have more political, if I have more influence, right, I would expect to be able to translate that influence into higher positions in the wealth hierarchy. The inability to do so maybe would then bring some kind of dissatisfaction or frustration. So that's sort of my speculation for why we would see this kind of effect specifically in some social contexts. Right. So So you may ask why we wouldn't see the opposite effect, right? So people who have lower wealth position than power hierarchy. So why this effect is not symmetric? People who are with lower wealth than power position, why wouldn't they be dissatisfied in hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes if they think that having higher position in the wealth hierarchy would entitle them to having a higher position in the power hierarchy, right? I can also only speculate. There has also been the argument that some statuses are more visible than other statuses. So the wealth status is probably more visible than the power status, right? So then if you then if you are and the more visible status, if they are low, if you are unable to bring them higher, this would generate more of a psychological impact. So that's sort of my somewhat ad hoc speculation to explain this asymmetric kind of effect we're observing in terms of status inconsistency. Okay, so finally, I just want to say that so our study also contributes evidence to the literature on how institutional context would also influence people's health and well-being, and also condition the relationship between people's positions in the social stratification system and their well-being. Okay. And it contributes to the research on the psychosocial aspect of health inequalities, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so let me briefly mention the limitations. We are using cross-sectional data that's collected at only one point, so this would limit our ability to make a causal argument, but we're actually trying to look at differences in statuses and the relative importance of different statuses. So I hope that kind of relation would be less vulnerable to sort of the endogeneity argument. We also would need to explore more measures of the institutional context. So so far, we're just using one relatively comprehensive but very general measurement of the institutional context, where I definitely plan to explore more measurements of the institutional context, first to corroborate what we have found so far, and also to provide more specific measurement of the institutional context that may interact with what we think are the mechanisms that can activate status inconsistency. Okay. All right, so let me stop here. So this is our founder that founded our data collection. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, Lei Jin for it's very rich in theory and also thank you a lot. So I would want to go.
I really enjoyed that. Many aspects of that, including the diagonal reference model or the diagonal mobility. I haven't seen that for many years, so I'm so glad it's still being used. So I had just one question about the gender. So you might have already looked into this, but given your results, I was thinking about especially gender in relation to the power question. So I would expect that in more authoritarian regimes, women would say they have less power than men. And looking at your results, is it the men who are in these middle hybrid regimes who are feeling, disgruntled because they feel they have power but lower wealth. So I'm just interested in sort of gender dynamics.
Yeah, this is a very good question. And on the car coming here, I was thinking I should look more at, you know, who are reporting that they have more political influence. I didn't do that, but I will definitely. And that gender difference would be very interesting to explore. But I cannot answer your question right now, but I'll definitely take a look.
Thank you for sharing with us your interesting study, Professor Jin. So I know stratification researchers typically use the imagined ladder with 10 steps to measure people's perceived relative standing within the social hierarchy. But less frequently, people use that to measure political power. One problem is that the distribution of political power and the distribution of economic resources within the society are very different. When you talk about the distribution of income or wealth, it's roughly log normal. So after log transformation, it will be roughly normal. So most people will be in the middle, and relatively few people will be in two extremes. But when you talk about the distribution of political power, that's very different. So you would imagine a very few number of people have extremely, being extremely influential, but the vast majority of the population will have very little or no political power, especially in authoritarian regime. So that would make people make it difficult for people to place themselves within imagined ladder with 10 steps.
Right.
So for example, so when we talk about economic resource, so I'm going to use you as an example. So say Tarani earned twice as my income, so it'll be so I could easily so maybe you are like 2 steps above me on the ladder, but in terms of power, so I know that as the head of the department, you're certainly more powerful than I do, but it would be difficult to say that you're 2 times or 3 times more powerful than me. So
Right.
yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. That's a very good question. And it is quite, so first of all, I agree with you that we are much better able to place ourselves on a wealth hierarchy than a power hierarchy, because we probably don't think very much in terms of our political power, right? That doesn't come very much into our mind. So it would be a more difficult question for people to ask. So that's the situation. If that's the situation, then the measurement of people's status or their ranks in the power hierarchy would definitely be less accurate than their position in the power hierarchy. I'm not sure what the implication of that would be in terms of studying status inconsistency. It's possible that, you know, if there's a lot of errors in people's self-reporting in terms of their position in the hierarchy, assuming that there is actually a true hierarchy that can be placed, then I suppose the measurement of incongruence would also be quite, there's a lot of error in it, right? So if you differ, for example, by 1 level, it could just be the same, right? It's just because I'm not able to place myself very well on this ladder. So the only thing I can think of is that we need to experiment more with how to define the incongruence measures. I'm not sure, did I step on anything? Let's see. Yeah, so that's the only thing I can think of, but I do agree with you. This is a difficult question to ask and answer. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to answer it, how to ask it in the survey, especially because in the beginning, we just wanted to say power. But the Gallup people came back to us and said that it's really hard to ask this question in many societies because they don't have the same word for power in a lot of places. So you have to be more specific. And that's why we came up with this instance of local government. And I don't think it's a very, it would be a hard question to answer for the respondents. But I think even if we just ask for power in a general way, it's also would be a question, hard question to answer. So I think that's just something we have to think more about.
Presentation. Actually, I have a question about the measure as well. You use a subjective measure of wealth, right? I'm wondering to what extent it reflects the real institution, like the objective wealth in the like hierarchy. So I'm wondering whether you have the data in your survey to reflect the like income or wage, or whether you compare the objective measure to the subjective measure, and to what extent it influences your findings.
Okay, so we do have data income and actually controlled for people's income because I would interested in specifically in the sort of psychosocial aspect of status inconsistency. So I controlled for income to sort of control for the actual material conditions. So we do have income here, okay, and the data. Right, so there is income measured per capita income in quintiles, right? So 20% within each country. People are divided into 5 equally spaced groups in terms of their income. So we controlled for that. I didn't actually specifically look at how this correlates with their own subjective rankings. And in the study, we wanted to look at subjective measures because it's closer to people's understanding of whether there is an inconsistency than just looking their objective positions. So I think using subjective rankings, the choice was actually deliberate.
Thank you. Because I think maybe the democracy index may cause some misinformation and also influence their perceived like their perception about their own wealth. This is my concern. Maybe in democratic countries, maybe people have more information about the whole distribution, but in some like hybrid regime, maybe you receive less information about the whole distribution of the income, and then maybe you perceive yourself like incorrectly or inaccurately. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's definitely possible. You need to know the people around you to make comparisons and things like hierarchy. Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. But coming back to this particular study, we do want to look at subjective status, right? So this is the subjective status that matters.
Okay.
All right, and I have one question. It's like, so what you present here is showing the kind of homogeneous impact of incongruence, right? But I wonder, like, where this impact may actually depends on your status, location in a hierarchy, right? So maybe this incongruence doesn't matter much for the lower status, but matter more for those people in the higher status. So, for example, like in low status, it's not good to be powerless and poor at the same time, right? But in a higher status, maybe incongruence matter more, right? So in a low status, in ours, incongruence may be better, right? So poor but has some power, or has some power, have no power but have a little bit more wealth, may be actually better for your psychological well-being, right? So I wonder where you have kind of explored this kind of heterogeneity of this impact depending on the status of this hierarchy. So in our incongruence, it's actually good for those in low status, but bad for those in high status.
Why would it be good for
Because think about this, so for people in a low status, like you don't want to be poor and powerless at the same time. You want to have something, right? And so in that case, incongruence may be actually better for your psychological well-being, right? But in high status, you probably want more congruence. You want to have power and wealth at the same time. So that's why when you present this homogeneity effect, but that may kind of mitigate or offset this differential direction of this impact when you kind of put them all together in your analysis. So maybe kind of try to explore more about this heterogeneity in the impact by dividing the sample into different hierarchy or status in the hierarchy.
I think I got what you said. But wouldn't that be already controlled for? I mean, what you're thinking is that if I'm low, if I'm poor, right?
Mm.
And I'm also powerless, so that's not good because
Yeah.
I'm low on both.
Mm.
But presumably, it's been controlled already. The constituents, the two hierarchies are already controlled for in the model.
Yeah.
So the low
Yeah.
position, the effect of the low position are already controlled for. And the fact that I'm both poor and powerless would be bad for me is because I'm low on both.
Mm.
It's not because of the either incongruent or not congruent.
Right. So it's not about where like control now, it's about the direction of this impact, maybe differential or maybe even in opposite direction at different location of the hierarchy. So when you compare all the group into the same congruent group, right? And so this different direction of impact maybe offset each other, right? So that's why you find this no effect, right? But if you kind of divide a sample into different status, maybe you'll find this kind of differential direction, especially if the impact may be opposite to each other, right? Then putting them together, you can actually find no effect here. Yeah, just something maybe something may explain. All right, thanks so much for the great talk. Yeah.